The Mojave Desert stretched before Daniel Reeves like an ocean of sand and stone, endless and unforgiving, beneath a sun that seemed closer here than anywhere else on Earth. He had been walking since dawn, following a path that existed only in his memory and the faded notations on a map that had belonged to his father, chasing a story that most people had dismissed as the ramblings of a dying man. But Daniel had learned long ago not to dismiss anything, especially the words of those who had nothing left to lose by telling the truth. At 54 years old, Daniel carried the weight of 3 decades of military service in every step he took. His body was a catalog of damage, from the knee that had been reconstructed after a helicopter crash in Afghanistan, to the shoulder that ached constantly from the shrapnel that was still embedded too close to his spine to be safely removed. His face was weathered by years of sun and wind in places most Americans would never see, and his eyes held the particular distance of someone who had witnessed things that could never be unseen. He had retired from the Army 5 years ago, a command sergeant major with enough medals to cover his chest and enough memories to haunt 10 lifetimes. The transition to civilian life had been brutal, as it was for so many veterans who had spent their entire adult lives in service. He had tried working security, had attempted to settle into the suburban existence that his ex-wife had always wanted, had even enrolled in college courses that were supposed to give him new skills for a new chapter. None of it had taken. The restlessness that had driven him to enlist at 18 was still there, still demanding motion and purpose, and the kind of challenge that civilian life rarely provided. So he had become a treasure hunter. Not the romantic kind from movies, with fedoras and whips and ancient temples, but the methodical kind who spent months researching historical mysteries and weeks in the field following leads that usually turned out to be dead ends. He specialized in military history, using his knowledge and connections to track down lost equipment, forgotten caches, and the occasional artifact that museums were willing to pay good money to acquire. It didn't make him rich, but it kept him moving, kept him engaged, kept the darkness at bay in ways that nothing else had managed to do. His companion in this endeavor was a dog named Ghost, a white German shepherd who had served with the military police in Iraq before being retired due to injuries sustained in an IED attack that had killed his handler. Daniel had adopted him 3 years ago, recognizing in the dog the same displacement and trauma that he himself carried. They had healed each other, in the way that only those who have shared the crucible of war can truly understand. Ghost was more than a pet now. He was a partner, a confidant, a fellow survivor who asked for nothing but loyalty and returned it 1,000-fold. Ghost was trotting ahead, his white coat stark against the red and brown of the desert landscape. His ears were pricked forward, his nose working constantly, reading the terrain in ways that Daniel's human senses could never match. The dog had an uncanny ability to sense when something was out of place, when the land held secrets that were waiting to be discovered. It was one of the skills that had made him valuable to the military, and it was equally valuable to Daniel now. They were searching for something that most people believed didn't exist, a ship in the desert. The legend had been circulating for over a century, whispered in cantinas and written about in obscure journals that only the most dedicated researchers ever found. A Spanish galleon lost in the Colorado desert sometime in the 16th or 17th century, carrying a cargo of pearls and gold that would be worth millions in today's currency. The story went that the ship had somehow sailed up the Gulf of California during a period of unusually high water, had become trapped when the waters receded, and had been slowly buried by the shifting sands until it vanished from sight entirely. Most historians dismissed the legend as fantasy. The geography didn't support it, they said. The Spanish records made no mention of such a loss. The whole thing was probably a tall tale that had grown in the telling, a desert mirage that existed only in the imaginations of those who wanted to believe. But Daniel's father had believed. Henry Reeves had spent the last 20 years of his life obsessed with the lost ship, convinced that he had found evidence proving its existence. He had collected maps and documents, had interviewed old-timers who claimed their grandparents had seen the ship, had spent countless weekends trudging through the desert in search of something that always seemed just out of reach. The obsession had cost him his marriage, his career, and eventually his health. He had died 6 months ago, alone in a nursing home. His final words to Daniel, a plea to continue the search. Daniel had been skeptical at first. He had spent most of his adult life far from his father, their relationship strained by distance and disagreement, and the particular kind of silence that grew between men who didn't know how to express love. But going through his father's papers after the funeral, Daniel had found something that changed his mind. A map, hand-drawn and annotated, showing a location deep in the desert that Henry had marked with a single word: here. The map had come with a letter, written in his father's increasingly shaky handwriting, explaining how he had finally pieced together the clues that had eluded him for decades. The ship was real, the letter claimed. Henry had found satellite imagery that showed an anomaly beneath the sand, a shape that was too regular to be natural, too large to be anything other than what he had been searching for. He had been too sick to make the journey himself, but he had done everything possible to ensure that Daniel could find it if he chose to. "I know you think I wasted my life on a fantasy," the letter concluded. "Maybe I did, but I also know that you understand the need to search for something, to pursue a goal that others might not understand. This is my legacy to you, son. Not the ship or its treasure, but the search itself. The journey is always more valuable than the destination. I hope someday you'll understand what I mean." Daniel had read the letter 3 times, tears streaming down his face that he would never admit to shedding. And then he had packed his gear, loaded Ghost into his truck, and driven to the coordinates his father had marked on the map. That had been 4 days ago. He had been searching ever since, covering ground methodically, using his father's notes and his own military training to eliminate areas that couldn't possibly contain what he was looking for. The heat was brutal during the day, and the cold was bitter at night. But Daniel was used to harsh conditions. He had survived worse in places where the enemy was trying to kill him. The desert was indifferent to his presence, which was almost a relief. Ghost stopped suddenly, his body going rigid in the posture that Daniel recognized immediately. The dog had found something. Daniel approached slowly, scanning the terrain for any indication of what had caught Ghost's attention. They were in a low depression between 2 rocky outcrops, a natural bowl that had probably held water at some point in the distant past. The ground here was different from the surrounding desert, harder and more compact, with a reddish tint that suggested mineral deposits beneath the surface. Ghost was pawing at a spot where the sand had been disturbed, perhaps by wind or perhaps by something else. Daniel knelt beside him and brushed away the loose material, revealing something that made his heart skip a beat. It was wood, old wood, gray and weathered, but unmistakably shaped by human hands. Daniel brushed away more sand, his movements becoming increasingly frantic as the scope of what lay beneath began to reveal itself. The wood was part of a larger structure, a curved surface that extended in both directions farther than Daniel could uncover with his bare hands. He pulled out his folding shovel and began to dig, Ghost helping with his powerful paws, both of them driven by an excitement that seemed almost electric in the dry desert air. An hour later, Daniel sat back on his heels and stared at what they had uncovered. It was a ship, an actual, genuine, impossible ship, buried in the sand of the Mojave Desert, hundreds of miles from the nearest ocean. The hull curved upward from the sand like the rib cage of some enormous creature, its wooden planks held together by iron fittings that had rusted into reddish-brown streaks. The ship was lying on its side, partially collapsed, but its basic structure was still recognizable. Masts had long since fallen, but Daniel could see where they had been attached. The stern was more intact than the bow, rising perhaps 10 feet above the surrounding sand, with what appeared to be windows or gun ports visible in the weathered wood. Daniel's first thought was that it couldn't be real. He had been in the desert for 4 days, exposed to heat and exertion that could easily produce hallucinations. But Ghost was there beside him, panting in the heat, clearly seeing the same thing that Daniel saw. Dogs didn't hallucinate, at least Daniel didn't think they did. His second thought was of his father, of the decades Henry had spent searching for this very site. The old man had been right all along. The ship was real, the legend was true, and Daniel had found it, guided by a map and a letter, and a promise made to a dying man who had never stopped believing. He sat in the shadow of the ancient vessel for a long time, trying to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. This would change everything. Historians would have to revise their understanding of early exploration in the region. The story of the lost ship would go from legend to fact. And Henry Reeves, dismissed as a crackpot by nearly everyone who knew him, would be vindicated at last. But Daniel didn't move to call anyone, didn't reach for the satellite phone that would connect him to the outside world. Something was holding him back, some instinct that told him there was more to discover here, that the ship itself was just the beginning. Ghost was already investigating, his nose pressed against the weathered wood, moving along the hull with the focused attention of a dog on a mission. He paused at a spot where the planks had separated, creating a gap just large enough for a medium-sized dog to squeeze through. He looked back at Daniel, whined once, and then disappeared into the darkness inside the ship. Daniel scrambled to his feet, his heart suddenly pounding with concern. The structure was ancient, clearly unstable. If it collapsed while Ghost was inside, the dog could be trapped or crushed. He rushed to the gap and peered into the shadows, but could see nothing beyond the first few feet.
"Ghost, come back, boy! Come on!"
There was no response, no sound of the dog moving inside the wreck. Daniel's concern escalated into genuine fear. He pulled out his flashlight and shined it through the gap, but the beam only illuminated dust motes and ancient timber. Wherever Ghost had gone, he was beyond the reach of Daniel's light. There was only one thing to do. Daniel found a larger opening in the hull, a place where the wood had rotted away entirely, leaving a gap just wide enough for a man to squeeze through. He took a deep breath, said a prayer to a god he wasn't sure he believed in, and climbed inside the ship. The interior was a chaos of collapsed beams and drifted sand. Whatever cargo the ship had once carried was long gone, looted or decayed over the centuries. But the basic structure was more intact than Daniel had expected, with the deck above providing a kind of ceiling that had protected the lower sections from the worst of the elements. Daniel moved carefully, testing each step before committing his weight, his flashlight beams sweeping back and forth as he searched for Ghost. He found the dog in what must have been the captain's cabin, in the stern of the ship where the construction was most solid. Ghost was sitting perfectly still, his attention fixed on something that Daniel couldn't see from his position. "Ghost, what is it? What did you find?" The dog didn't move, didn't acknowledge Daniel's presence in any way. Whatever he was looking at had captured his attention completely, overriding even his training to respond to his handler's voice. Daniel approached slowly, his flashlight beam following Ghost's gaze. And when the light finally revealed what the dog was staring at, Daniel felt his knees go weak. There was a chest against the far wall of the cabin, a large wooden trunk that had somehow survived the centuries of decay that had claimed so much else. It was open, its lid thrown back, and inside? Inside was a skeleton. Not scattered bones, but a complete skeleton, arranged in the chest as if the person had climbed inside and simply gone to sleep. The bones were small, delicate, clearly those of a child. And clutched in the skeleton's hand, somehow preserved across the centuries, was a piece of paper. Daniel stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he was seeing. A child had died in this ship, had crawled into this chest for some reason, and had never emerged. The thought was horrifying, a tragedy that had played out in silence and solitude in this desert grave. But it was the paper that drew his attention. Paper should not have survived for centuries, should have crumbled to dust long ago. Yet there it was, yellowed but intact, covered with writing that Daniel couldn't read from this distance. He approached the chest slowly, reverently, understanding that he was in the presence of something sacred. Whatever this child's story was, whatever had brought them to die alone in a ship buried in the desert, they deserved respect. Daniel would not desecrate this resting place, would not disturb the bones that had lain here in peace for so long. But the paper was different. The paper was a message, left across the centuries by someone who had known they were dying and wanted to leave something behind. Daniel felt that he had a right to read it, perhaps even an obligation. He reached into the chest, carefully avoiding the bones, and gently extracted the paper from the skeleton's grasp. The skeleton's hand crumbled as he touched it, the fragile bones finally giving way to the weight of years. Daniel whispered an apology and withdrew with the paper, moving to a spot where the light was better. The writing was in Spanish, in a hand that was uneven but legible, the words of someone who had written in difficult circumstances. Daniel's Spanish was rusty, but he had learned enough during deployments to Central America to make out the general meaning. I am Maria Elena, daughter of Captain Rodrigo Castellanos. My father's ship, the Santa Isabella, became trapped in this place when the great waters withdrew. We waited for rescue, but none came. The crew left to seek help, but they did not return. My father stayed with me, but the heat and the lack of water took him. I buried him in the sand beside the ship. I am alone now. I have hidden in this chest because the animals come at night, and I am afraid. I have little water left and no food. I do not think I will survive. If you find this letter, please tell my mother in Seville that I loved her. Please tell her that my father tried to save me, that he was brave until the end, and please pray for my soul, that God will forgive whatever sins I have committed and welcome me into his kingdom. I am 12 years old. I do not want to die. Daniel read the letter 3 times, each reading more difficult than the last as the weight of the tragedy settled onto his shoulders. A 12-year-old girl, trapped in a ship in the desert, watching her father die, and then waiting alone for a rescue that never came. The horror of it was almost unbearable. Ghost had moved to Daniel's side, pressing against his leg, as if sensing the emotional turmoil that the letter had provoked. Daniel reached down and stroked the dog's head, grateful for the comfort of that warm presence. He looked back at the skeleton in the chest, at the small bones that were all that remained of Maria Elena Castellanos. She had been waiting for 400 years for someone to find her, to read her letter, to fulfill the requests she had made in her final hours. Daniel was the one who had finally arrived, guided by a map drawn by his own father and a dog who had somehow known that this cabin held secrets worth discovering. He sat down on the ancient deck, the letter still clutched in his hands, and wept. The tears surprised him. Daniel had long ago learned to suppress his emotions, to push past the grief and horror that were constant companions in his profession. He had lost friends in combat, had seen atrocities that would haunt him forever, had learned to function in circumstances that would break most people. But something about this girl's story, about her loneliness and fear, and final plea for someone to remember her, broke through all his defenses. Ghost climbed into his lap, a behavior the big dog rarely exhibited, and Daniel wrapped his arms around him, taking comfort from the warmth and solidity of his companion. They stayed that way for a long time, man and dog together in the darkness of the ancient ship, mourning a child who had died centuries before either of them was born. Eventually, Daniel's tears subsided, replaced by a determination that felt almost sacred. He had found Maria Elena. He had read her letter, and now he was going to fulfill her final wishes, no matter what it took. He carefully tucked the letter into a waterproof pouch and secured it in his pack. Then he spent the next several hours carefully examining the cabin and the surrounding areas of the ship, documenting everything with photographs and notes. He found other artifacts that had survived the centuries, a compass that had belonged to Captain Castellanos, a rosary that had probably been Maria Elena's, a logbook that was too damaged to read but might yield secrets under proper conservation. He did not disturb Maria Elena's bones. She had rested here in peace for 400 years, and she would continue to rest until proper authorities could give her the burial she deserved. But he did say a prayer over her, the Our Father that he had learned as a child and had not spoken in decades. The words came back to him automatically, and he hoped that wherever Maria Elena's soul had gone, she could hear them. When he finally emerged from the ship, the sun was setting, painting the desert in shades of orange and red that seemed fitting for the magnitude of what he had discovered. Ghost emerged behind him, shaking sand from his white coat, and together they made camp in the shadow of the vessel that had been Maria Elena's tomb. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his tent, Ghost beside him, staring at the darkness above and thinking about the chain of events that had led him to this place. His father's obsession, the letter and the map, his own decision to follow a lead that most people would have dismissed as fantasy, and Ghost, always Ghost, whose instincts had led them to the precise spot where the ship lay buried, and then into the cabin where Maria Elena had been waiting.
He thought about his father, too, about the years they had spent estranged and the reconciliation that had come too late. Henry Reeves had died believing that his life's work was a failure, that he would never see the ship he had spent decades searching for. But he had left the map and the letter, had given Daniel everything needed to complete the quest. In a way, Henry was here now, sharing in the discovery that was as much his as Daniel's.
"I found it, Dad," Daniel whispered into the darkness. "You were right all along." There was no response, of course, but Daniel felt something shift in his chest, some weight that he had been carrying for years suddenly growing lighter. He had been angry at his father for so long, resentful of the obsession that had taken priority over family, bitter about the childhood he had spent watching his father chase a dream instead of being present in reality. But now, lying in the desert beside the ship that had consumed Henry's life, Daniel finally understood. The search had never been about the ship. Not really. It had been about the need to believe that there was something extraordinary in the world, something worth pursuing despite the odds. Henry had found meaning in the quest itself, in the research and the exploration, and the refusal to accept that some mysteries would never be solved. And he had passed that gift to Daniel, had given his son a purpose that was finally helping him find his way home from the wars that had nearly destroyed him.
The next morning, Daniel made the call that would change everything.
Within a week, the desert was swarming with experts, archaeologists and historians, conservators and journalists, government officials and curious onlookers who had heard about the discovery and wanted to see for themselves. The Santa Isabella, as the ship was now confirmed to be, became the biggest archaeological story in years, generating headlines around the world.
Daniel stayed as long as he was needed, answering questions and providing context, but he made sure that certain things were done properly. Maria Elena's remains were removed with reverence and care, transported to a laboratory where they would be studied and eventually returned to Spain for burial. Her letter was preserved and translated, its contents shared with the world as a testament to the courage of a 12-year-old girl who had faced death alone and still thought of others.
The search for Maria Elena's mother in Seville proved fruitless, of course. 400 years had erased any direct descendants, any family who might have mourned her loss. But the letter was published in Spanish newspapers, and dozens of people wrote to claim some connection to the Castellanos family. Whether any of them were truly related was impossible to determine, but it didn't matter. Maria Elena was no longer forgotten. Her story was known, her final wishes fulfilled.
She had asked to be remembered, and now she would be remembered forever. The treasure that legend had promised was never found. Whatever gold and pearls the Santa Isabella had carried had either been taken by the crew before they abandoned the ship or had been buried in parts of the wreck that were too damaged to excavate. Some people were disappointed by this, having hoped for a dramatic discovery of Spanish gold. But Daniel wasn't disappointed at all. He knew that what they had found was worth far more than any treasure.
His father was vindicated too, just as Daniel had hoped. Henry Reeves was acknowledged as the researcher whose decades of work had made the discovery possible. His name was mentioned in academic papers and news articles, his photograph displayed alongside the artifacts that were being recovered from the wreck. The crackpot who had wasted his life chasing a fantasy was revealed to have been a visionary, a dedicated scholar whose perseverance had finally paid off.
Daniel arranged for a plaque to be placed at the site, honoring both his father and Maria Elena. It read, "In memory of Henry Reeves, who never stopped searching, and Maria Elena Castellanos, who waited to be found. Sometimes the impossible is just waiting for someone brave enough to believe." Ghost was honored too, his role in the discovery acknowledged by the archaeological team and the media that covered the story. The white German shepherd became something of a celebrity, his photograph appearing in newspapers and magazines around the world. He handled the attention with the dignified patience that was his trademark,
accepting pets and treats from strangers while staying close to Daniel's side. When the initial frenzy died down and the experts had what they needed, Daniel packed up his camp and prepared to leave. He had spent nearly a month in the desert, the longest he had stayed in one place since his retirement. But it was time to go, to return to a life that now felt fuller and more meaningful than it had before. He stood at the edge of the excavation site, Ghost beside him, and looked at the ship that had brought him here. The Santa Isabella was more exposed now, its full outline visible after the archaeologists had carefully removed the sand that had buried it for centuries. It was beautiful in its decay, a testament to the craftsmen who had built it and the sailors who had sailed it. "Thank you," Daniel said quietly, not sure whether he was addressing the ship, his father, Maria Elena, or some combination of all three. "Thank you for letting me find you." Ghost looked up at him, his dark eyes filled with the understanding that had always made him such an extraordinary companion. Daniel scratched behind his ears, and the dog leaned into the touch with obvious pleasure. "Ready to go home, boy?" Ghost's tail wagged, an answer that needed no translation. They drove north, leaving the desert behind. The Santa Isabella and Maria Elena and Henry Reeves, all now part of a story that the world would never forget. Daniel didn't know what would come next, what new quest would capture his attention and drive him forward. But he knew that whatever it was, Ghost would be there beside him, ready to find whatever secrets the world had hidden. The months that followed brought changes that Daniel hadn't anticipated. The discovery of the Santa Isabella had made him famous, at least within certain circles, and he found himself in demand as a speaker and consultant. Universities wanted him to lecture on desert archaeology. Museums wanted him to advise on expeditions. Television producers wanted to make documentaries about his life and his discovery. Daniel accepted some of these opportunities and declined others, trying to find a balance between the public attention that the discovery had brought and the solitude that his soul still craved. He gave talks about the importance of following leads that others dismissed, about the value of persistence and the power of belief. And he always told the story of Maria Elena, making sure that the 12-year-old girl who had died alone in the desert was remembered as more than just a footnote in the Santa Isabella's history. Ghost accompanied him everywhere, becoming almost as famous as Daniel himself. The dog who had found the lost ship was a draw in his own right, and Daniel often found that audiences were more interested in hearing about Ghost than about the archaeological details of the discovery. He didn't mind. Ghost deserved the attention, and watching the old war dog accept adoration from strangers was a healing in itself. The money that came from speaking fees and consulting work was more than Daniel had ever made as a treasure hunter. He used some of it to establish a scholarship in his father's name, funding research into historical mysteries that mainstream academia might otherwise ignore. He used more of it to support veteran organizations, giving back to the community of fellow soldiers who had struggled as he had to find their place in a civilian world. And he used some of it to build a memorial. The Maria Elena Castellanos Memorial was erected at the site where her remains had been found, a simple stone structure that told her story and honored her memory. It included a reproduction of her letter, translated into English and Spanish, so that visitors could read her words for themselves. And it included a statue of a young girl looking toward the horizon, her expression caught somewhere between hope and sorrow, waiting for a rescue that would finally, centuries later, arrive. Daniel visited the memorial whenever he was in the area, which was often. He would sit beside the statue and talk to Maria Elena, telling her about the world that had remembered her, about the people who came to pay their respects, about the ways her story continued to touch hearts long after her death. Ghost would sit beside him, patient as always, as if he understood the significance of these conversations. One day, nearly a year after the discovery, Daniel received a package from Spain. It contained a letter and a small wooden box sent by a woman named Isabella Martin, who claimed to be a distant descendant of Maria Elena's mother. The letter explained that Isabella's family had preserved a story across the generations, a story about a ship that had been lost and a girl who had never come home. They had never known the details, never had confirmation that the story was true, but they had remembered, had passed down the name of Maria Elena Castellanos as a family tragedy that must not be forgotten. And now, Isabella wrote, they finally knew what had happened. They had read Maria Elena's letter, had wept at her words, had felt the connection to an ancestor they had never known. They wanted to thank Daniel for finding her, for reading her message, for making sure the world knew her story. The wooden box contained a rosary, old and worn, that had belonged to Maria Elena's mother. According to family tradition, it was the rosary that the mother had been clutching when she received the news that her husband's ship had been lost. She had never given up hope that her daughter might be alive somewhere, had prayed with this rosary every day until her death. Isabella wanted Daniel to have it as a token of gratitude for what he had done.
Daniel held the rosary in his hands, feeling the weight of centuries and the power of faith. Maria Elena had asked for her mother to be told that she loved her. The message had taken 400 years to arrive, but it had arrived. The circle was finally complete.
He took the rosary to the memorial and placed it in a small glass case beside the statue. It would stay there forever, a testament to a mother's love and a daughter's courage, connected across the centuries by the unbreakable bonds of family. Ghost was getting old. The white German shepherd who had found the Santa Isabella was now 12 years old, ancient for a dog of his size and breed. His muzzle had gone completely gray, his joints were stiff, and he could no longer accompany Daniel on the long hikes that had once been their daily routine. But his spirit remained strong, and his bond with Daniel had only deepened with time. They had been through so much together, from the discovery in the desert to the fame that had followed, from the quiet moments of mourning to the public celebrations that had honored their achievement. Ghost had been there for all of it, steady and loyal, asking for nothing but companionship and returning everything in love. Daniel knew that their time together was growing short. He had already begun to grieve, to anticipate the loss that was coming, even as he treasured every remaining day. He talked to Ghost more than ever, sharing his thoughts and feelings in ways that he had never been able to share with another human. The dog listened with the patience of a saint, his dark eyes reflecting an understanding that transcended species. On a cool October morning, exactly 2 years after they had found the Santa Isabella, Ghost didn't wake up. Daniel found him in his usual spot beside the bed, his white coat gleaming in the early morning light, his body still and peaceful. There was no sign of pain or distress. He had simply gone to sleep and not woken up, slipping away in the night as quietly as he had lived. Daniel sat beside his dog for a long time, his hand resting on the still warm fur, tears flowing freely down his weathered face. He had known this day was coming, had tried to prepare himself for it, but nothing could truly prepare you for the loss of a soul that had become part of your own. He buried Ghost at the memorial, beside the statue of Maria Elena, in a spot where the morning sun would warm his grave. The funeral was private, just Daniel and a few close friends who understood what the dog had meant to him. But word got out, and in the days that followed, flowers and letters began to appear at the memorial, tributes from people around the world who had been touched by the story of the veteran and his dog who had found an impossible ship in the desert. The headstone was simple: Ghost. He found what was lost. Daniel visited the grave every day for the next month, talking to Ghost as he had when the dog was alive, sharing the mundane details of his life and the profound thoughts that came to him in the silence. Slowly, gradually, the sharp edge of grief began to dull, replaced by a gratitude for the years they had shared and the discovery they had made together. He adopted another dog eventually, a young German shepherd named Shadow, who had been retired from military service after his handler was killed in action. The pattern was familiar, the healing that came from giving a home to a creature who had also served and suffered. Shadow was different from Ghost, younger and more energetic, with his own personality and his own quirks. But he filled the empty space in Daniel's life, gave him a reason to get up in the morning and a companion to share the journey that still stretched before him. Daniel continued his work as a treasure hunter and lecturer, though he became more selective about the projects he took on. He was in his late 50s now, his body even more battered than before, and he had learned that some things were more important than chasing legends. He spent more time at the memorial, more time with the family that the discovery had brought back into his life, more time simply being present in a world that had finally become bearable. The Santa Isabella was eventually fully excavated, its artifacts distributed to museums in Spain and America, its story told in books and documentaries that would preserve it for future generations. Maria Elena's remains were returned to Spain and buried in a ceremony that drew hundreds of mourners, descendants of the families that had sailed on the ship 400 years ago.
Daniel attended the burial, standing at the back of the crowd as the small coffin was lowered into Spanish soil. He had fulfilled his promise to Maria Elena, had delivered her message and told her story. She was home now, reunited with the family she had lost, resting at last in the peace she had sought in her final hours.
As he turned to leave the cemetery, Daniel felt a weight lift from his shoulders that he hadn't even known he was carrying. The quest that had begun with his father's map and ended with a child's skeleton in a desert ship was finally complete. He had found what was lost, had brought closure to mysteries that had waited centuries for resolution.
And in the process, he had found something even more valuable, a purpose that had finally made sense of the years of wandering that had followed his retirement. The story of the abandoned ship in the desert continued to spread, becoming one of those tales that people told around campfires and in history classes, an example of the impossible becoming possible through persistence and faith. Daniel's name was attached to it forever, the veteran who had followed his father's dream and found what everyone said didn't exist. But Daniel knew that the real hero of the story was Ghost, the white German shepherd who had sensed something in the sand, who had led his handler to the exact spot where the ship lay buried, who had found his way into the cabin where Maria Elena had been waiting. Without Ghost, the Santa Isabella might have remained hidden for another 4 centuries, its secrets preserved by the desert that had swallowed it so long ago. Dogs knew things, Daniel had come to believe. They sensed connections and mysteries that human beings were too blind to see. They led their people to the places they needed to go, to the discoveries they were meant to make. Ghost had been more than a companion. He had been a guide, a finder of lost things, a bridge between the present and a past that was waiting to be uncovered. On the 10th anniversary of the discovery, Daniel returned to the desert one last time. He was 64 years old now, his hair completely gray, his body held together more by stubbornness than by physical fitness. Shadow walked beside him, the black German shepherd who had inherited Ghost's role as companion and protector. The site had changed in the decades since the discovery. The ship was gone, removed piece by piece to museums and laboratories where it could be properly preserved. In its place was a visitor center and a reconstruction of the Santa Isabella, built to scale so that tourists could understand the size and structure of the vessel that had been found here. The Maria Elena Castellanos Memorial was the centerpiece of the site, drawing thousands of visitors each year who came to pay their respects to the girl who had died alone in the desert. Daniel walked to Ghost's grave, sat a few feet from the memorial, and knelt in the sand. The headstone was weathered now, the letters slightly faded, but still legible. He had brought flowers, the same kind that had grown wild around his property in Oregon, and he arranged them carefully against the stone. 10 years, old friend, he said quietly. Can you believe it's been 10 years? So much has changed, so much has happened. But you're still the one who started it all. You're still the one who found her. Shadow lay down beside him, pressing against Daniel's leg in a gesture of comfort that was familiar and welcome. The black dog had never known Ghost, had never walked the same paths or found the same secrets, but he seemed to understand the significance of this place, the weight of the memories that lived here. Daniel sat in silence for a long time, watching the sun move across the sky, thinking about everything that had led to this moment. His father's obsession, his own restlessness, the dog who had appeared in his life at exactly the right moment, Maria Elena's letter, preserved across the centuries, waiting for someone to read it and fulfill her dying wishes. The universe was strange, Daniel had come to believe. It worked in ways that human beings could never fully understand, connecting events and people across vast distances of time and space. He had been meant to find the Santa Isabella, meant to read Maria Elena's letter, meant to bring closure to a tragedy that had waited 400 years for resolution. The path that had led him here had seemed random at the time, but looking back, he could see the pattern, the purpose that had been guiding him all along. Ghost had been part of that purpose. The dog had found what was lost, had led his handler to a discovery that had changed everything. And now, resting in the desert sand beside the memorial of the girl he had found, Ghost was part of the story forever, immortalized alongside Maria Elena and the ship that had become their shared legacy. Daniel rose slowly, his joints protesting the movement, and took one last look around the site. Tourists were beginning to arrive, families with children and couples holding hands, all of them drawn by a story that had captured the world's imagination. They would learn about the Santa Isabella and Captain Castellanos and the girl who had died alone in the desert. They would learn about the veteran and his dog who had found her.
And they would leave with a sense of wonder, a reminder that there were still mysteries waiting to be solved and secrets waiting to be uncovered.
"Goodbye, old friend," Daniel said softly, his eyes on Ghost's headstone. "Thank you for finding her. Thank you for finding me."
He turned and walked away, Shadow at his side, leaving behind the desert that had given him so much and taken nothing in return. The sun was warm on his face, and the wind was gentle at his back, and somewhere in the distance he could almost hear the sound of waves crashing against the hull of a ship that had sailed these sands 400 years ago. The story was complete now, written in stone and preserved in memory, a testament to the power of persistence and the unbreakable bonds between humans and dogs. The abandoned ship in the desert had given up its secrets, and the world was richer for knowing them. And Ghost, the white German shepherd who had started it all, rested peacefully in the sand, his work finally done, his legacy secure, his place in history assured.
The discovery inside the ship had been truly unbelievable, just as the headlines had promised. But the real miracle was what had happened after, the connections that had been forged, and the healing that had occurred. Maria Elena was remembered, Henry Reeves was vindicated, Daniel had found purpose, and Ghost had proven once again that dogs know things that humans can never fully comprehend.
That was the gift of the desert, the blessing of the ship, the legacy of a dog who had found what was lost and led his human to something worth finding. In the end, it wasn't about treasure or fame or historical significance. It was about love, the love of a father for his son, the love of a mother for her daughter, the love of a man for his dog. That love had transcended centuries and crossed continents, had connected souls who had never met and never would, had proven that the bonds between hearts were stronger than death itself. The abandoned ship in the desert had been found, and in finding it, Daniel had found himself at last.